The M1918 Mk1 trench knife was the outcome of extensive trials conducted by the U.S. Army Expeditionary Force in June 1918. The trials compared 4 different trench knives currently in use by the Entente: the U.S. Army's M1917, the French M1916, the used knife, and a British knuckle knife. The new Mk1 knife combined the best perceived characteristics of the 4 knives. The final design was created through collaboration of the Army Expeditionary Force and the Engineering Division of Army Ordnance.
Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Knife Chats with Tobias. Hi everybody. This is the knife I want to talk about today. This is actually a reproduction of the M1918 Mk1 trench knife. Now this reproduction is made by Windlass Steelcrafts out of India. It is probably the most accurate you're going to find on the market right at the moment. There are other ones out there, but probably a little more expensive and a little harder to find. This one is more or less readily available. It goes for right around $100. Now there is also one from Bud K that's not quite as accurate as this one, and it goes for about $30. We'll be seeing one of those in a little bit as well. But what I really wanted to do is actually talk a little bit about this actual knife. Now, as you can see, this one is stamped US 1918, and then it says LF&C 1918 underneath. That is because LF&C, the company that made the bulk of these in America, well, that's where this reproduction is copied from. They made the bulk of them. There are a few other companies that made them as well. These knives came out, as you can see, 1918. And there's a lot of confusion about this because, well, there's actually 2 M1918 trench knives. This is probably the one that is more commonly thought of as the M1918 trench knife, but it is not the one that saw the most action in World War I. In fact, this particular one, well, the ones made by LF&C, the ones made in the United States during World War I, never quite managed to make it overseas to see combat. The ones that were actually used, the Mk1 trench knives that were used in France, were knives that were made in France and are usually stamped Aulion, A-U-L-I-O-N. Now, the ones that were made in the United States, primarily by LF&C, I'm sorry, it's a very problem. Landers Ferry is probably the easier way to say it, but that's the company that was actually making them in the United States, along with, I think, 4 or 5 other companies had contracted for them. But the bulk of them were being made by this particular company in the United States. And the contract was calling for, I can't remember how many, but the idea was these knives would be ready in early 1919 for the American Army. So by the time the production really got going in the United States, the war had already ended and production ended up being cut. So the American-made ones never quite made it over to France to serve during World War I. And they basically ended up getting stockpiled here in the United States for future needs, I guess you could say. Now, as I mentioned, this is the M1918, and I mentioned that there was another M1918. And now, while this particular knife is an M1917, the M1918 looked pretty much the same as this. The only difference was they were being made in 1918. There are 2 different kinds of guards on these. It's basically a D guard. It had a walnut handle with finger grooves carved into the walnut handle to help position the hand in place. The blade is unsharpened. It's 9 inches long. It is designed specifically for stabbing, and it was designed to be able to puncture the heavy German clothing that was being worn in the trenches and stuff. Now, the primary difference between an M1917 and an M1918 was supposedly the way the blade was attached to the handle. One of them had a screw bottom that would be screwed on, so the very back would be held in place with a screw or a bolt or a nut or something like that, whereas the other version was basically just pinned in place. And there's debate on which was which, because you find these knives marked M1917 and M1918 with both styles, so it's very difficult to determine which one was an M1917 and which was an M1918, other than it would be stamped up on the D guard here that it was an M1917 or an M1918. Essentially the same knife, but the year of production changed the model number. And this is the one with the pyramid D guard with the pyramid bumps. Another version had folded over flanges that served the same purpose as the pyramid bumps. But this is basically similar to the knife that would have been an M1918, just plain M1918 trench knife. And it had a couple different sheaths. This is the later version sheath from what I understand. And as you can see, this kind of holds onto the belt in a fashion that was similar to the way knives were, or frogs and sheaths were held onto belts during World War II with this wire hanger here. Now that's probably why this became the M1918 Mark I. And the way this knife came about is, well, the other knife wasn't popular, so the Army decided to have some trials, and they basically came up with 4 different knives and from different countries to see which would be a good replacement for the M1918 or M1917 trench knife that was already in use by the U.S. And there were like 3 different knuckle duster knives, plus the French M1916 trench knife. And the one thing that they determined very quickly was they really liked the blade of the French M1916 trench knife. And this blade is almost an identical copy of what that blade would have been. Now, the French never really got into knuckle knives. Matter of fact, the Germans also weren't into knuckle knives. The 2 countries that seemed to really favor knuckle knives were the British and the Americans. And it's kind of strange because the Americans during World War I were primarily fighting with the French, or fighting with the French against the Germans. So I'm not sure where their attraction for the knuckle duster knives came from. But in any case, there was some kind of fascination with knuckle duster knives with the Americans and the British. And when they finished doing all their trials and everything, this is what they settled on. And this is a solid bronze handle with a skull crusher tip back here, and basically a set of brass knuckles attached to it. And if you notice, it's got a wide guard up in the front to protect the hand from any kind of blade or anything else coming in contact with the hand. So that was the idea of the knife. And like I mentioned, with the exception of the ones that were made in France under contract for the United States Army, none of the American-made ones made it to World War I in time for fighting. Now, the sheath that came with these was this. Now, the ones that the French made were made out of iron. The ones that the Americans made were made out of steel. And if you notice, it's got these two little clamps on the back, which actually are what your web belt would slide into. And if you can see here, when you put the knife into the sheath, your belt is here, and if you can tell, this would be pressing into your side, which would not necessarily be very comfortable. And also, if you can see, if it's on the belt, the knife is going to be hanging out because most of the weight is way above it. There's nothing, it's not supported from above. It's supported from the middle area of the blade. So the sheath was not really well designed in any shape or form. And by the time these knives started actually getting issued to soldiers, it would have been World War II, at least for the M1918 Mark I's that were made in the United States. And so let's move on to World War II and the Mark I trench knife. So here we are now. It's 1941, war is looming, and this is really the only combat knife that is in stores for the United States military, both Army and Marines. This is it, the Mark I trench knife, or the M1918 Mark I trench knife, a veteran of World War I. You know, the war that we're starting, that it looks like we're going to be facing, is not the same war that this knife was designed for. And the United States knows that, but this is it. This is the knife they have on hand that they can start issuing. And so they started issuing it, and it received mixed reviews right away, with the scabbard really catching all sorts of grief. It just was not very popular. It did not stay on the belt very well. It caused the knife to dig into your side. It rattled, made noise, all sorts of problems with it. The next problem they had was the fact that the brass knuckles, while very intimidating and useful in a battle and such, meant that you had some restriction on how well you could grip the knife. I mean, you basically have to take your fingers out of the guard in order to change any kind of positioning of your hand, because this is really designed for one thing, and that is for punching and fighting. It's not a very useful utility knife. And what's worse is, because of the width of the guard, if you put it in a regular sheath, it does not snap right, it does not hang right. There's all sorts of issues with it. And so even with the people who enjoyed the knife and were happy with the knife in general, they did not like the way it attached to the web gear, and it was not an easy knife to carry. Now, there were also plenty of people who just deemed it way too heavy for a good fighting knife, and several other things with it. But the blade was very popular. A lot of soldiers liked the double-edged blade. They weren't as crazy about the handle on the knife. And so one of the first things you started seeing happening to these knives during World War II was the handle started getting modified. Now, this is Bud K's version of the knife. Now, originally it had the rounded portion here as well. Also, if you can see here, the Bud K, the handle is not exactly the same as what you're seeing on this knife. Also, the blade is shorter. This has got a 6 3/8 inch blade as opposed to what it should have had, which is a 6 3/4 inch blade. This knife also has only one sharpened edge. The top edge here is not sharpened, the bottom edge is. But we're using this as a stand-in because it's a lot cheaper to do modifications on this one. Now, one of the first modifications that you saw the American GI doing with this knife is they would grind off the side protections here. And the reason they did that is once you've removed the bulbous sides of this knife, it will now fit into a sheath more properly. And you can dispense with using the steel scabbard here and have a proper sheath so that the knife will hang from your side in a more proper fashion. And so that is one of the first things that happened to it. The next thing that you started seeing happen is they would remove the knuckle guard. They would just, same thing that they did here, they would just grind off all the knuckles, and you would have a bronze handle with a little bit of a finger groove here so that you would know how to grab it, but the knuckles themselves would either be gone or they would just cut out the holes and have the bumps on the outside. And so that's the other thing you would see with these knives during World War II. They would change them up because so that they could be better utilized as a utility knife, and also just more comfortable when you're wearing it. The other thing that happened quite often with these knives is the handle would just be gone. They would take off the handle, and that's because all you have to do is loosen up the skull crusher cap down here, and you can pull the blade off of the handle. So you end up with something like this. You've got your M1918 Mk1 blade for a trench knife, and then a set of knuckle dusters. Instead of one weapon, you now have two weapons, and this was a common practice during World War II. Just use the knife blade, make a new knife, and then have a set of brass knuckles. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of these knives just did not quite survive World War II. They ended up being busted up for parts. You also end up seeing like knuckle duster knives, so this handle being used with like an M3 trench knife blade, things of that nature. I've even seen one that's using the spike blade for a Lee Enfield rifle. The what is it? The number 4 Lee Enfield bayonet.
I need to interrupt myself for a second here. These knives, often called a Z-Force knuckle duster, were a knife that came out in the 1980s, and they're basically a pure fantasy knife. As far as I know, there are no actual records of this actually happening during World War II, but you will see these in quite a few places. Anyway, back to the show.
The thing is the knife itself remained very popular, and you even seen examples of these knives being used in the Vietnam War. Now, they were probably not original Mk1 trench knives, and they may have been modified and such, but these were also still being used in the Vietnam War. The especially, it seems like British Commonwealth forces like New Zealand and Australia, they were also very big on knuckle duster knives. The British commandos also had their own knuckle duster knife, the BC-41, which remained very popular throughout World War II. Australia was actually making private purchase knuckle duster knives for U.S. servicemen serving in the Pacific during World War II. So the idea of the knuckle duster knife not really being that popular with American troops during World War II is not really quite true. They were still popular, and even more so, they remained a substitute standard all the way through January of 1945. So soldiers were still being able to get these through regular supply chain all the way through the war almost. And they remained very popular among like the U.S. Rangers. They also remained popular with the 82nd Airborne. The 82nd Airborne apparently really did enjoy this knife. But you also saw them with just the regular dog-faced soldier who was serving, in the regular line infantry. Matter of fact, there's actually a Willie and Joe comic strip that features one of these knives. So they must have had some kind of popularity throughout the war. And after the war, they obviously became one of those things that a lot of people sought after and were looking for. But a lot of them were definitely modified during World War II, so they did not quite survive intact and in a pristine condition that you would have expected them to. Many of them were modified, especially the guard. So, matter of fact, you even see copies of this knife, some early copies of the knife that have a slim guard on it, and I believe that's because the person who is making the copy was copying a knife that had been modified during World War II and had not even realized that it was not the way the knife was originally issued. In any case, this is one of my more fascinating knives. I know this is just the reproduction, and the reproduction cost, well, over $100, but to find one in this kind of condition today and expect to pay any kind of cost under like $400 or $500, well, if you do, you're just extremely lucky. That's really the bottom line. This is one of those military knives that is highly sought after by collectors, even when it comes down to reproductions. A lot of military collectors will accept the reproduction if it's a decent shape, or even if it's not in that great of a shape. A lot of people are quite happy with the Bud K copy of it because, well, it's a $20 knife, and you know, it's stabby pokey, and that's all cool too. But it is just one of those knives that if you're into military knives, somewhere along the line you kind of like the knuckle dusters, I think. At least I know I do. In any case, I thought I would share this a little bit with you and do a little bit of a ramble about it. Hope you enjoyed it. I know it's a little bit long, but well, I really like the knife. And I will talk to you again soon, and stick around. I'll have some slides comparing a few of these knives. Thanks a lot. let me take just a second to thank you once again for dropping by and spending a few minutes here at Knife Chats with Tobias. I really do appreciate it, and I do appreciate any comments that you leave. So please remember to give me that thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next episode is up and running. Thanks again for dropping by. Really do appreciate your time here.